I first got interested in this by very happy accident about 6 months before I became president of the IPA and needed an agenda. And I actually came to it obliquely in that I started reading a bit about economics, standard economic theory. And by the way, I recommend everybody does the same. And the two things I found about economics when I started, strangely, I had a strange illness for about 4 days and ended up reading books like Tim Harford's The Logic of Life. There's a book by a chap called Stephen Landesman called Armchair Economist. And actually, standard economic theory is very, very beguiling and very appealing. And you can see why, with its impression of kind of mathematical certitude, it's particularly seductive to people in business schools, extraordinarily seductive to people in boardrooms, because you can just assume things. And while I was reading it, to some extent being seduced, I also had another kind of terrifying insight, which is that this discipline was really quite attractive, but it was the most marketing-unfriendly way of looking at business that you could possibly imagine. I was talking to someone at lunchtime who's the head of, he's effectively the head of data at Deutsche Bank. And he said the most dangerous words in business are, let us assume that. And he pointed out, and as I discovered, in order to achieve the mathematical neatness that makes it so attractive, what economics assumes is that every transaction is made willingly between two, as a one-off trade, between two anonymous actors, each pursuing self-interest in an atmosphere of perfect information and perfect trust. So, first of all, there's no relationship allowed for because it's a one-off transaction. And of course, in a world of perfect information and perfect trust, you would actually have no need for marketing at all. I freely admit that. The good news for us is that those conditions exist somewhere between very, very rarely and never. And indeed, one of the reasons why there's a crisis of trust in business now is precisely because people have modelled business decisions on the assumption that trust can be treated as a given and assumed away. If you talk to really, really bright economists, or you talk to really interesting cyberneticians, or you talk to Nassim Taleb, or someone like that, they understand brands actually perfectly in scientific terms. A brand, if you think about it, inspires trust simply because if you have a valuable reputation, you have something to lose by selling something that's shit. It's one of the reasons we don't like buying from anonymous people, because there's a degree of uncertainty in any transaction. When you buy a second-hand car and drive it away, you don't know whether it's going to be the best car you've ever bought or whether the gearbox is full of sawdust. And in the case where you buy from someone with a reputation, there's a feedback loop. You can go and ruin the person's reputation through malicious gossip or whatever. In the case you've bought from someone completely anonymous, there's no feedback loop. What you find is that if there's a farm that sells its own beef, it's quite likely to be beef. Because it's quite risky slipping a horse into that beef, because people will find out and won't buy from your farm ever again. If, by contrast, you have a government definition of something called commodity beef, it's in everybody's interest to slip some horse into that, because there's no actual feedback, there's no skin in the game, there's no feedback to the person who actually provided it. The thing has been commoditized, and effectively any attempt to contaminate that is something you get away with. It's why in the Soviet Union they eventually discovered you needed branding. If you didn't make factories stamp their name on the rivets they made, generally, as far as I can see from communism, it's a bit like consumerism, but it regards lathes and rivets and tractors as the highest form of production. But if you didn't make people actually stamp their name on things, every single factory had an incentive to produce as many totally shit rivets as they possibly can, because there was no feedback loop to stop people buying those rivets in future. There was no learning mechanism, there was no kind of evolutionary mechanism at work. So these people actually understand brands extremely well in scientific terms. It's just that economists, to achieve simple mathematical neatness, don't. Now, what I would say is that, first of all, marketing is to some extent the science of understanding what economists are wrong about. So one of the reasons I recommend reading standard economic theory is, first of all, you'll understand why a lot of the people in business have this peculiar delusion that they do, and you'll be able to talk to them in language that they understand. And the second reason is that you will actually understand that the main role of marketing is actually to provide those things which economics has assumed away. Being absolutely candid, behavioural economics is a rebranding. Nothing wrong with that. It's a rebranding of psychology. But it's a rebranding of psychology which allows you to have conversations about psychology to people who wouldn't be happy talking about psychology. If you think about a typical operations officer or finance director, if you say to them, we've got some people in to talk about psychology, he'll effectively say, not my department, nothing to do with me, and anyway, isn't that cheating? If you say we're coming to talk about behavioural economics, lots of people from different parts of a business will turn up and listen in a way they didn't before. It's one of those cases of rebranding that I think is particularly successful. It simply gives something a consideration that it never received before. One of my favourite examples of rebranding, by the way, from the practical world is the rebranding of what used to be called Silverlink Metro as the Overground. Is everybody aware of that? Occasionally nicknamed as the Ginger Line. That line, by the way, or 95% of it, has existed for about 20 years. Nothing new about that. What it didn't have was any salience. Nobody actually... I don't know how many of you are North Londoners? North Londoners basically are slightly stupid in that they see the whole of London entirely through the template of the tube map. Have you noticed that? So they go, I couldn't possibly move to South London, there aren't any tubes. What they fail to understand about South London is actually full of railway lines, which have the additional advantage of being above ground and therefore not disease-ridden. But they don't appear on the map which North Londoners use to understand London. Okay? Now, as a result, when I used the Silverlink Metro, as it was then known 13 years ago, there was absolutely nobody on it. And when you got off at a station, it felt like Bad Day at Black Rock. You were the only person there. Okay? All they did, they built a few things and added a few new trains, but the main thing they did is they pretended it was part of the underground network and made it orange. And suddenly, 4 million North Londoners who were completely unaware of its existence or what possible role it might play in its lives, now saw it as an essential part of London's infrastructure. To a point where young people apparently want to move, is this right, they want to move to a flat on the Ginger Line in Peckham because it makes it really easy to go to Shoreditch, although why that's an incentive. As a taxi driver said to my brother-in-law, he said, I don't really understand this Shoreditch place. He said, when I grew up, there used to be genuine cockneys here. He said, now it's just rich people pretending to be tramps. But the point about that is, in many ways, this is a rebranding of psychology. It's like the rebranding of Silverlink Metro. But it rebrands it in such a way that it's actually worthy of consideration and forms part of the mental map of people who did not consider it beforehand. Now, I don't claim this is the answer to every question. I'm merely saying that every good planner, every good advertising person should understand, first of all, the vocabulary of this. And simply because it gives you a vocabulary which enables you to talk to people who aren't marketers. Very good copywriter colleague of mine said, the worst thing about the vocabulary of marketing, he said, it's like the vocabulary of astrology. It's perfectly plausible and sensible if you're talking to fellow believers. But if you're talking to anybody else, they think you're mad. You know what I mean? If you do believe in astrology, you can have a conversation with a friend who also believes in astrology, going, boyfriend, girlfriend, playing up a bit at the moment. Oh, I know, he's a Sagittarius. Yes, they're like that, aren't they? And to the two of you, that's a perfectly reasonable conversation. To anybody else listening, you're basically deranged. Okay? And the first important thing about this is it gives us a vocabulary borrowed from economics rather than borrowed from psychology, which actually which fits with the kind of vocabularies which are used by people who make business decisions. Marketing does not have that vocabulary. And I know this because very recently, a couple of people at Ogilvy were talking about the fact that Cannes Week fell in the middle of their wedding anniversary or birthday, and it was a bit of a nuisance. And 3 people had all said to them the same thing, well, why don't you take your wife or husband down to Cannes with you? And they answered in terrifyingly the same way, all three of them. They said, I can't do that. My husband's a neuroscientist. If he saw this was the industry I worked in, he'd never take me seriously ever again. And so what it does is it effectively takes what the advertising industry has always known instinctively. Maybe it's creative people, maybe it's planners, but we've always known this stuff instinctively. There were ads done in 1948, how else does a month's salary last a lifetime, for De Beers. Perfect example of framing and anchoring. Plink Plink Fizz was designed to create a social norm around using 2 Alka-Seltzer rather than 1. The phrase designated driver was invented as a marketing campaign on the grounds that if there was a name for a behaviour, you were also creating a norm for a behaviour. Suddenly there was this thing called a designated driver, so we should really get one too. All those things were done instinctively by brilliant people. The problem they had, and the problem all of you will have known you've had, is that they lacked, in many cases, the vocabulary. Those were the people who got lucky. Those were the people who got their ideas to run. There were thousands, I believe, of more brilliant psychological insights coming out of advertising and marketing, which never happened because people didn't have the vocabulary or the reference to a science to justify their instincts. And do not for a second, I don't want anybody for a second to think that what this is a science which replaces the role of instinct in discovery or progress in marketing or advertising. It's emphatically not about that. It may be a tool which helps you look. You know, maybe you'll stumble on gold or be able to recognize it better because you have this toolkit. It does not substitute for insight at all. It may help you get there, but more important still, it may help you defend and explain the insight in terms that actually help you win the argument. Because previously, we had these wonderful insights, and apart from saying it just feels right, we had absolutely nothing from any recognized science to back us up. And I think we're in the position, I'll just end here, in that we kind of knew this stuff. I started working in direct marketing, and one of the first things I noticed, which seems strange to me, is that extraordinarily small things would have monumentally large effects on whether people bought a product, who the letter was from, the order in which the application form was actually laid out, would sometimes double or triple the number of people responding to something. We've just done an experiment with a call centre where adding the simple sentence, most people choose B, but you could also have A or C, that pretty much doubles the number of people who make a purchase, simply because there's a social norm that helps them decide and makes it comfortable to choose. And we kind of knew this stuff, but never really spotted. Two things we failed to do. We didn't really spot the significance, and we didn't really attempt to codify it. We kind of knew there was a lot of this stuff going on, but we never really sat down and codified it. And that is actually the common failing of people in business, generally. There's an awful lot of stuff that business people kind of know or have found out, but the two things that happen is they don't spot its wider significance, and they don't really sit down and do the hard graft between actually systematizing and codifying what they found. And the classic business example is I'll end on this, a guy called Patrick Matthew, who 2 years before Darwin even set sail on the Beagle, wrote in a chapter a perfectly good description of the theory of evolution. But he was a practical man, he was a businessman, he was actually a fruit farmer, and the book was about naval arboriculture, how to grow trees for the British Navy. So this fantastic theory of evolution, which he'd more or less come up with off his own bat, wait for it, it was written down in half a chapter and it was put in the appendix. And that's, I think, what we did. We knew this stuff, but we actually didn't really put it center stage, because we thought, well, it looks a bit trivial, so it'll make us look silly, and we really need to be talking about brand strategy here, despite the fact that in any complex system, small things are almost as likely to have big effects as big things are. And secondly, we never actually made the effort to actually sit down and put in the work. Thankfully for all of us, some other people have done a great deal of that work for us, including the people you'll see later on this evening. Thank you very much indeed.